on this while I was working initially on a piece on Avon N. Williams, who was a civil rights leader in Nashville. And I decided it was time to do a whole book so people would know where Tennessee fit into the civil rights movement.
Civil rights movement.
Right.
Of course, Dr. Love, we're getting ready for our first commercial break. After we come back, we're going to give you an opportunity to talk about the civil rights movement in general, and then to sort of zero in on the contribution that you've made here dealing with the movement in the state of Tennessee from a local historical point of view. Okay. And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. The topic is the civil rights movement in Tennessee, a narrative history, and the guest is Dr. Bobby Lovett, a professor at Tennessee State University, the author of the civil rights movement in Tennessee. Dr. Lovett, let's talk about the civil rights movement in Tennessee, but before we do that, let's sort of give our audience some background kind of information relative to what really prompted the so-called civil rights movement nationally, and then how it impacted Tennessee according to what you have here.
Well, one of the ways I start the book off is explaining to the readers that the African American has always had a civil rights movement since the first ships landed in Jamestown in 1619, that African American slaves were trying to express their freedom however they could, including running away, slave rebellions. And but I say that the civil rights movement really begins in 1865 with the emancipation of the slaves. And African Americans in Tennessee and other places in the South began what I call the first post-slavery civil rights movement. And that movement continued up until about 1881. And it was to do three things: to secure citizenship for the former slaves, of course, to get an amendment so that slavery could never come back, the 13th Amendment, and to get the right to vote. And they accomplished all of those things by 1881. And by 1881, the Jim Crow era started to corrode some of those progressive changes. And from 1881 until about 1930, the second civil rights movement started. And that was basically to try to undo the damage that Jim Crow had done. And so a lot of civil rights organizations will be founded in that period of time. The Afro-American League in 1890, Du Bois's Niagara Movement in 1905, the NAACP will be formed in 1909, the Urban League will be formed in 1910, the Garvey movement in 1920, and so on. And that movement sort of peters out by the early 30s with the coming of the Great Depression. And then in 1935, the civil rights movement that we now talk about really started in 1935-36, when Charles Hamilton Houston, Dean of Law School at Howard University, Harvard Law graduate, was hired by the NAACP to come up with some legal strategies about how to attack Jim Crow. And that ultimately led to a lot of civil rights cases they won. They won 12 or 15 cases in the United States Supreme Court. And the big case they finally won it, and that was Brown versus Board of Education in May of 1954. And that's what started the real public activity, heightened activity of the civil rights movement. And many people equate that period from Brown, 1950s and the 60s, as the civil rights movement. But that was just the culmination of a civil rights movement that African Americans had started in 1865.
And then in a real sense, even earlier, what you said, when they first came and got off the boat, that there was an interest in freedom and civil rights.
That's right.
No matter what you call it, at that particular time,
that's right.
Very good.
The slave rebellions like Denmark Vesey's rebellion in the 18th century, the Coors Nat Turner's rebellion, the Underground Railroad people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and William Lloyd Garrison. We don't really put a label of civil rights leaders on these people, but they were fighting for the same things as civil rights leaders were fighting for in the 1950s and the 1960s, and that's human freedom and human